All right, guys. This is the second half of the period two review. We did the other half in during community time, I should say, last week, and unfortunately, due to advisory and early dismissal and all the stuff, we couldn't get it done during community time. And just to keep us on pace, I made this video. It'll be short, and it's really for like the 7 guys that showed up for the review last time. Thursday this week, I'll do period three during community time. Um, and remember here, it's 1607, right, which is Jamestown, and then to 1754, which is the French and Indian War, the end of it. And it's all about the colonies, right? That's the main topic of period two. So this is where the bell rang on us during community time last time. We were talking about how we had the Atlantic trade system, or what we've referred to sometimes as triangular trade, but all of these legs would have been there, right? And much like I said in class, but not to really use on the test, no, not too many ships really did like one triangular circuit, right? Of like, uh, you know, um, finished goods, right? From Boston to the west coast of Africa to, say, Jamaica back to Boston. There were ships that ran legs of those, but not the whole thing. More importantly, right, is if you take the time to look at all the different stuff that's going on, right, in the actual picture, right. So if you look at it here, the idea here is that you have basically manufactured goods, right, coming back. With the highlighter, there you go. You have manufactured goods, right, going this way, and you have resources, right, going this way. And then, of course, you have slaves coming from West Africa, and mostly sugar of some sort, right, coming from the Caribbean. Now, outside of this, and if we had had time to do the actual like question that I like to ask about this, is that realize that in this Atlantic economy, it's more than just goods, right? You have people, right, in the form of slaves or colonists or immigrants of any sort. You also have ideas, right, that are making their way across each side of the channel, right? Which, when we get to the you know French and Indian War, or we get to the American Revolution, right, the ideas of what happens in North America are going to help to spread to the French Revolution, stuff like that. Now, mercantilism, right, which was the economic policy of the British, right, during that time period. Um, my sons have like destroyed my Apple Pencil cap. Um, what's going to happen is, right, the mercantilist idea was that the world had a fixed amount of goods, and since it had a fixed amount of goods, they had to compete for everything. So the way they instituted their mercantilist policy in England was to pass the Navigation Acts. The Navigation Acts basically said, right, that ships had to, or certain goods, mostly like the stuff that people wanted to trade, had to be shipped on British ships to British ports, right? So, British ships to British ports. Okay. So, basically the idea, yet again, of mercantilism, just to cover all the bases here, is that the mother country exists for the mother country exists, the colonies exist for her. And so the colonies send back their resources, right, to the mother country. The mother country then processes them and sails them back to the colonies. And it's supposed to be a perfect system, yet again, for the mother country. What this does, right, like we showed in class, was that the people in the colonies are always buying more expensive stuff than they're selling. So they would actually lose money in the long run. And so that the way that the American colonies dealt with this was they smuggled, right? They traded with the French in Barbados and the West Indies, right, for sugar. Um, they sailed to Holland and other places, right, that the British didn't want them to go. And they made money that way, which is outside of the Navigation Acts, and that's part of that term, salutary neglect. Remember, the idea was is that the British were too busy fighting their wars and all that sort of stuff to really enforce their laws. And since they weren't really enforcing the Navigation Acts, the colonists kind of did what they wanted, and paid off the customs agents and smuggled whatever they wanted. And the country really grew as a result of that, even though they had this bad economic policy. Slavery in British North America, right? Every colony participated in it, even though we don't think about it that way. Even in New England, they had slavery, just not very much. And the South, right, it becomes like a way of life. In that way of life, right? Remember, dudes from Barbados are going to immigrate to South Carolina, similar climates, similar attitudes, right? And with them, they bring the Barbados slave codes, right? And the Barbados slave codes were like super stringent slave codes. I think maybe in the picture here, you can't really read it, can you? But it's basically like, it outlines strict punishments and, basically all the stuff you think of when you think of the violence and torture dealt with slavery. One of the unique things to uh, slavery at this time, and particularly American slavery, was the idea of chattel slavery in perpetuity. Chattel slavery just means the slaves were viewed as property, and that goes all the way back in time, to the antiquity. Like you can look at Roman farms and slaves and all that sort of stuff. But one of the big differences there was that a lot of times slaves in antiquity were slaves because they were poor or they had been conquered in war or whatever. And it didn't necessarily mean that their offspring, right, were going to be slaves. And in the American system, it did. If you were a slave and you had kids, your kids were going to be slaves, right? Just perpetuating the system and making more and more wealth for the slave owners. So a lot of these times, um, there was resistance, right? Covert resistance um, was basically like not really like fighting back, but doing stuff to make it hard for the colonies. So destroying farming equipment, not doing a good job, right? Basically any way to like resist, right, and not be like beaten. Keeping their cultural traditions. A lot of times, right, uh, they slaves do, adopt Christianity, but maybe they don't adopt a Christianity right away, or they weave in their own beliefs, right? Um, some initially a lot of uh, plantations didn't want their slaves to get married, and sometimes they'd marry in secret, stuff like that, right? To keep their individuality and to resist the sort of like um, the homogeny of slavery and like them all becoming like one thing. And so that would have been like a covert way to resist it, and then overt ways would have been like rebellion. And the one that Heimler brings up in the video that I made this from was the Stono Rebellion. Um, and you can look that up if you're interested in that. Relationships with the Native Americans. So this takes us to King Philip's War, right? King Philip's War will be 1675 to 1676. The fast version of this is that King Metacomb, no, Massaoit, I don't know how to say his name, had been basically the Indian chief that had made friends with the Plymouth colony, basically like the Pilgrims, and that generation had worked things out. But there's always this like simmering um, distrust between the two. So after Massaoit's death, his son comes to power, King Philip, and he got that name because initially they were buddies as well with the Plymouth guys. But over time, the relationship frayed, and eventually there's going to be an Indian that says that King Philip's coming to get him. The Pilgrims find him dead. They assume it's Philip. They then hang the Indians they found responsible, which incensed King Philip, and then the war begins. Um, it really just kind of shows us the animosity between the two groups, right? The Plymouth colonists, right, are basically going to set out to eradicate the Native Americans. Um, it'll be the Indians will have the upper hand eventually. By the end of the war, right, it'll have shifted, and the Native Americans. they'll offer amnesty to some Native Americans, and the Native Americans will be tired of fighting, and they'll like accept it, which means they'll surrender. And then the Plymouth dudes turned around and like sold a bunch of them into slavery. So obviously, there's not a lot of love lost between the two. Um, in the end, King Phillips will be killed, and that will really end the war. And it's considered like, you know, if we think of the colonists as Americans, it's considered like the bloodiest per capita war in American history, because like something like almost 10% of the fighting men, fighting age men in the colony died during that time period. But in reality, this just represents the relationship um, with the English and the with the Native Americans. Remember, like if we have our spectrum here, and it's, we'll say, bad, right, to so so to good, right, on relationships. Good, the French, right, the Spanish, and then the English are the ones that have no time for the Indians. All right, here, culture and religion. Remember the Enlightenment's going on during this time period. It is a intellectual movement. Okay, don't get it confused with the Great Awakening. We'll talk about it in just a second. In this in Enlightenment, right, the idea is that reason, rationality, science, right, are going to trump traditional ways of authority, like the church and the crown and that sort of stuff. One of the major ideas of the Enlightenment was the idea of natural rights, or rights that we are given by God, and thus the idea of the social contract, which means we give up some of those rights to enter into society or government, right? And this was a popular idea for guys like John Locke, who helped to inspire the Declaration of Independence, right? Old Thomas Jefferson, all that stuff. Now, this takes us to the Great Awakening, right? The Great Awakening is basically going to be a religious movement, a revival movement, right? Which started in Europe, right? And came to North America by the likes of itinerant preachers like Whitefield and Edwards here. They're both going to be instrumental in preaching, right, the Great Awakening. And so remember, this is going to emphasize personal salvation. It's going to lessen the ideas of American clergy. It's going to bring us the New Light clergy, right? A lot of their sermons were given outside, and we said that was important because it would draw more people and different groups of people. And, outside of the ideas of the Great Awakening, probably the most important thing or important aspect of it was it helped to create an American identity, because it was something that everybody got on board with, right? Everybody had a taste of the Great Awakening, this shared experience, right? From, I can't, I was going to say New England down to Georgia, right? Everybody had a had an understanding of it. The rich, the poor, the rural, the urban, and that helped to, right, that helped to bond and bring these people together, and help and start to bring this idea of like, Americans are different than the British, right? We're not there yet, but it's helping to form that. Lastly, one of the things, right, that's going to happen here is that the Americans, right, even though they find themselves as different, right, they're definitely holding on to their English ways, and so they saw themselves as, you know, British subjects or whatever, but the British were starting to slowly do things that began to sow the seeds of resentment, which we'll talk about more with the French and Indian War. But one of them was the impressment of sailors, right, which seemed unfair because they didn't necessarily follow any rules like they had to back in England. Other possible key terms here: the Edict of Nantes was the um, French declaration that allowed Protestants, right? They're going to repeal the Edict of Nantes, and what that's going to lead to is French Huguenots moving to Canada, or French Protestants moving to Canada. Protestant Reformation in England, right? Oh, Henry VIII. The reason for this being important: one, it centralizes the power of the English government, and it leads to the creation of the Puritans and all that sort of stuff, and the problems with the Puritans, which lead them to immigrate. The Virginia Company of London, and the ideas of the joint stock company, right? They're going to be the guys that set up Jamestown. The starving time was that initial time after Jamestown was started, and they starved and turned to cannibalism. I'm not really worried about the first Anglo-Powhatan War, but yet again, the conflict between the Jamestown settlers and the Native Americans, very similar to King Philip's War. Glorious Revolution, right, where William and Mary come to the throne in England. This is a bloodless rebellion, slightly, and it will be one of the things that's happening during that salutary neglect period. But then they're going to want to start to enforce their laws, which we'll talk about in the next unit. Quakers, right, going to be one of the religious groups in Pennsylvania that becomes very, very important and prevalent. To jump over here, basically, eventually it's going to upset the Paxton Boys. Remember, it said it was in Pennsylvania. Basically, the Paxton Boys got pissed off that they felt like the Quakers were trying to run the government in Philadelphia, and they were basically discriminating against non-Quakers. Blue laws, which were religious laws that were created, right? An example today, like a lot of times you get a blue law is like you can't buy alcohol or something on Sundays. Colleges are created in the North America during this time period. William and Mary and Harvard, and remember these are all going to be religious-based colleges. That's going to be the big reason for them. The witch trials, which talked about the social problems of New England, right? The halfway covenants and how they tried to extend their sort of dying Puritan, not religion, but like ways, right? By having like kind of like halfway members. The Scotch Irish were the people that settled throughout the back country in North America, and they were renowned for their sort of like tenacity and sort of like a hard living lifestyle. The Molasses Act was important. We talked about the Barbados sugar trade just a few minutes ago. Basically, the Molasses Act was a way to curtail trade with the French, right? And what it did, and I don't remember the actual numbers here, but remember it was 5 pence a barrel for molasses, right? They now changed it to 3 cents a barrel, so they dropped the tax, but they actually intended to enforce it. And as we'll see, this will upset the powers that be. And then lastly, Peter Zinniger, right? And the freedom of the press. This was a big win for the ideas of the freedom of the press, and a free press is important because it allows people to report back on the government. All right, guys, this is the end of period 2. And like I said, Thursday we will do period 3 during community time.